Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, we have a powerful hurricane that's wreaked havoc on the Caribbean islands. We also have that same hurricane heading toward the southeast coast of the United States. We're going to talk a little bit about the cost of leaving the European Union for the UK, and also continuing conflict between the United States and Russia over Syria. But we're going to start off with some media reports that were given citing the U.S. government sources saying that Washington is considering military strikes against Syria's government after America severed talks with Russia over the Syrian peace process. Also, as a note, Washington understands that a potential attack against Assad forces will bring America and Russia closer to conflict.
White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest said at a press conference there's a risk associated with taking strikes at regime targets. That risk includes attacking a regime that does continue to maintain a robust air defense system. It also edges U.S. and Russian military forces closer to confrontation. That doesn't serve anybody's interest.
Well, the peace process in Syria is being hampered as a result of America's cutting its ties with Russia over the Syrian peace process. Washington blamed Russia for being ineffective in its fight against ISIL, and in reaction, Moscow replied, the U.S. is ready to strike a deal with the devil to achieve its aims in Syria. So as diplomacy falters, what will the U.S. do next is the question on the minds of many.
According to the U.S. State Department's U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said that the Assad regime and Russia rejected diplomacy. On September 12th, when the ceasefire took effect, Russia and the U.S. were on a diplomatic path. When the State Department spokesperson Mark Toner was asked if it failed when the rebel groups used the ceasefire to strengthen their positions and when ISIL nearly took over Deir ez-Zor after the U.S. bombing of the Syrian military, admitted by mistake, did those things play no role in the failure of that deal?
Yeah, that was the question. Well, Mr. Toner's response, well, there was a series of events, including the attack, by mistake, he said, on Syrian forces, followed by the attack on humanitarian convoy, and then subsequently attacks on civilian targets in Aleppo. Well, we can talk about opposition groups using the pause to resupply, he said. That's a reality. So, Jeff, it sounds like he's saying that those things did play a part in the failed deal, and the State Department does concede that the rebels did have a role to play as well.
Now, Washington's narrative is that Assad and Russia suddenly rejected diplomacy and chose a military solution. Now, if you remember, Kerry was also for a military solution when he stated, I've argued for the use of force. I stood up, I'm the guy who stood up and announced we're going to attack Assad because of the weapons, and then, you know, things evolved into a different process.
So I wonder why there's this surprise that so-called Russia and Assad is wanting military force when the United States was at one point. Seems like they would still be on the same page, but apparently not. Many within the U.S. government are challenging the single policy on the Syrian war with the Obama administration, and which is once again considering a military action. And we may once again see the divergence of views within the administration on how to proceed in Syria.
Another move by Washington has strained relations with Russia over the Syrian crisis. The U.S. blocked a Russian statement condemning a recent shelling of the Russian embassy in Damascus. RT spoke with Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova about the current diplomatic deadlock. She said, "The whole time we were in negotiations, we realized very quickly that the United States had no joint position. Different organizations and structures in Washington were taking different positions on what is going on in Syria, and they have absolutely different views."
Sounds like a lot of confusion.
That's right.
She continued, "That was most difficult in our bilateral negotiations because we were not dealing with a partner with a joint view. We were dealing with people who were changing their opinion and point of view on what is going on in Syria actually every day." These concerns were also admitted by people in Washington, that in fact they were having a lot of change of views.
James Carden from The Nation magazine talked about establishing a no-fly zone and how it could be the next move from Washington. In an interview with RT, he said, "There's going to be a lot of pressure on the president to institute a no-fly zone, or the so-called safe zones, in northern Syria, and that would put us on the road to direct confrontation with the Russian Federation, Iran, and Syria."
Continuing, he said, "When you implement a no-fly zone, you necessarily have to commit acts of war. And we know that there are Russian troops on the ground and in the air, as well as the Syrian Air Force, and of course the Iranians are there helping as well. And even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that these things aren't easy. It sounds easy to impose a no-fly zone, but the reality is much different."
Well, we now turn our attention over to our field correspondent, Larry McGee, who has the particulars on a CBS This Morning interview. Larry, who was their guest and what did he have to say?
Big interview this week with Senator Lindsey Graham, who is a member of the Senate Arms Committee, and he sat down with reporters to offer his insight on the escalating crisis in the Euphrates region and the ongoing destruction of Damascus in particular. That, in fact, was the first topic up for discussion, with the question being what the senator thought was the best hope to try and save the people of Aleppo and what the U.S. should do. The senator's response was that there are three things worth considering, and the first is how do you stop the flow of refugees out of Syria, one being slaughtered in Syria and going to Europe and eventually making their way here to the U.S. The senator says the goal is to ensure that people are not being slaughtered and that they have a place where they'll be protected. The idea with the most support in that respect seems to be the notion of creating a safe and/or no-fly zone. But if that option is pursued, then Senator Graham believes the U.S. will be tested because once such a zone has been established, what is the U.S. prepared to do in the event that Syrian planes fly over it? Analysts believe that the actual issue, therefore, is enforcement. Is the U.S. willing to employ American warplanes over Syria in order to enforce a no-fly zone? President Obama said no to the option, but both Mike Pence and Hillary Clinton have expressed a willingness to move forward with it. Senator Graham says that unless we are willing to shoot down planes that enter the space to attack people that they call enemies, but that America calls victims, then it won't work. The talk specifically turned towards the possibility of Russian planes, to which the senator replied that if the U.S. is not willing to shoot down Russian planes, then it would not be a safe zone. The Arms Committee member went further to say that if Russia believed we would shoot them down, then they would not bomb. The next subject up for dialogue was North Korea and Iran, both nations of which the senator believes are areas of concern due to their missile programs and the perception of their instability. The big question, he believes, is what would take place in terms of a game changer if either nation had the ability to hit the American homeland. Senator Graham holds that the incoming president should be willing to attack North Korean nuclear facilities, and he suspects that if America were willing to do as much, then North Korea would actually cease its program. He also believes that Iran would dismantle its program if they truly believe that the U.S. would reimpose sanctions. Senator Graham attributes the boldness of America's perceived enemies to pacifism on the part of the standing president, who has exhibited a distaste for warfare and a preference for dialogue. It is an approach that the senator does not believe is shared by the Democratic frontrunner, whom he believes will be more than willing to employ military force. It is difficult to imagine a political conversation had at present that doesn't eventually focus on President Putin, who is viewed by some to be taking advantage of the current U.S. presidential race to push the Russian agenda in the Euphrates. Senator Graham foresees a land grab in Syria by the wayward member of the quartet during the time between now and when the next president is inaugurated, and he believes Aleppo will be destroyed in the next coming months. The senator believes that the Orthodox Russian head is a dictator, and if it were him, he says he would challenge President Putin on Syria. His position would be to train a regional force to usurp the Syrian government, he says, and if Russia bombs the people that America trains, then he says that would be a confrontation between the U.S. and Russia. When pressed to be more specific, Senator Graham says he would shoot them down. On Syria, his thinking ultimately is that there is currently no military pressure on President Assad at this moment to make him leave his office. And without military pressure, President Assad stays. And none of the circumstances in Syria that the West would like to alter will ever change. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Well, it seems like everyone in Washington is itching for an attack. The weather continues to be outrageous across the globe, Jeff, while Hurricane Matthew is spinning its way along the southeast coast of the United States. It has already brought devastating blows to the island of Haiti. At this point, the number of dead is unclear due to the extreme extent of the destruction, but there are reports that it could be as high as 800. The storm has also left thousands of people homeless and is the worst natural disaster in the country since the magnitude 7 earthquake that hit the Caribbean island in 2010.
Well, in France, there seems to be a storm brewing of a different kind. The French President François Hollande is warning Britain it will have to pay a heavy price for leaving the European Union. There must be a threat. There must be a risk. There must be a price, he said, arguing that his stance is necessary. Otherwise, quote, the principles of the EU will be questioned. So it sounds like they want to make a statement here.
Yeah, seems like it. Well, Hollande also believes allowing the UK to leave without consequences will risk other countries wanting to do the same to enjoy the supposed benefits without any downsides.
Well, France and the UK aren't the only countries struggling to get along. Tensions have recently flared up between Moscow and Washington since the breakdown of Syria's ceasefire deal brokered by the two countries. Fearing the U.S. will continue to target Syrian government forces in the war-torn country, Russia's defense ministry cautions their western neighbor against such actions. A spokesman for the defense ministry brought up the fact that Russia has their S-300 and S-400 air defense missile systems covering a surprisingly large radius. And the way he said it, Katan, it's like you're going to be surprised just how far we can reach out there and touch you.
Interesting. The spokesman said, quote, "It must be understood that Russian air defense missile crews will unlikely have time to clarify via the hotline the exact fire program of the missiles or the ownership of their carriers." He continued, "Any U.S. attacks on areas controlled by Syrian government could jeopardize lives of Russian troops."
The U.S. is not taking Russia's words lightly, Katan. Washington has threatened to impose costs on Russia over the Syrian conflict without UN backing. Now, this may be the harshest warning thus far from America. What began as criticism a few weeks ago has quickly shifted to direct threats.
Interesting. Well, from the Secretary of State to the U.S. Ambassador to the UN and many officials in between, the rhetoric is ramping up severely. U.S. Ambassador Samantha Power went as far as to say what Russia is sponsoring and doing is not counterterrorism, it's barbarism. And the White House Press Secretary Josh Ernst made a provocative statement when he said In this case, I wouldn't rule out multilateral efforts outside of the UN to impose costs on Syria or Russia or others with regard to the situation inside of Syria.
If you remember, it was only a month ago that the U.S. and Russia were holding peace talks, which brought about the 7-day ceasefire that we talked about in Syria. But now the war of words is as threatening as the physical armies. John Kirby, a spokesman in the State Department, said recently of the moderate rebels the U.S. supports, extremist groups will continue to exploit the vacuums that are there in Syria to expand their operations, which will include, no question, attacks against Russian interests, perhaps even Russian cities. Russia will continue to send troops home in body bags.
Wow. But how did it get to this boiling point so quickly? Well, there are, of course, some key factors leading up to the current situation. First, the U.S. broke the ceasefire when it killed 60 Syrian army soldiers who were on the front lines battling ISIL. While Secretary of State John Kerry admitted this took place, he also called it, quote, a terrible accident.
Well, secondly, the United States promised they would separate the terrorists of al-Nusra from the so-called moderate rebels, which they support. However, many months later, the U.S. is still backing both the rebels and the terrorists, but it doesn't end there.
Next, we have the U.S. military officials like Deputy Chief of Staff Joseph Anderson making their position brutally clear. He stated, the next group here is fighting against the regional military powers. These are existential for us and our allies. In other words, necessary for our survival.
He continued, the threat for this type of fight is a nation state with moderate capabilities, aggressive behavior, and engaging in militarized competition. So who would you pick for that one? Anderson concluded, I think it would be Russia.
Wow, yeah. Well, another U.S. Army Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, spoke about retaliating even if the enemy only thought about hurting the United States. He said, I want to be clear to those who wish to do us harm. We'll stop you and we'll beat you harder than you have ever been beaten before. While these words are coming from their mouths, U.S. officials are claiming Russia is being aggressive. So seems like it's a
calling the kettle black.
Exactly.
But there are some people out there who recognize the erratic behavior of Washington, like Michael Raddy, co-editor of BS News. Raddy told RT in an interview, the lunatic war hawks have taken over in Langley, in the Pentagon, and also in the White House. The spokesperson there talking about costs, and remember we said that there are going to be costs there, and the Russian cities being hit, Russian soldiers coming home in body bags. That to me sounds like an indirect order to terrorists to strike wherever they want to.
Interesting. Well, news media groups are saying it's like all the talk of peace has been forgotten. And a recent headline from Independent News reads, future war with Russia or China would be extremely lethal and fast, U.S. General warns.
Well, the 1 hour burning Yeshua Hawkins has revealed from the Holy Scriptures is on the way. The lines are being drawn and all sides are hoping to come out on top. The only problem is, in nuclear war, there are no winners. Well, just as the nuclear burning is prophesied, so is the protection for those who come out of this world and start keeping Yahweh's set appointments. Well, don't wait another day. Call, email, or write the House of Yahweh and start receiving the information that is vital to your salvation. Here's how.
And when you contact the House of Yahweh, don't forget to request your free copy of the monthly newsletter and the Prophetic Word magazine. To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at The House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494 or visit them on any of their websites at www.yahweh.com, www.yisroelhawkins.com, or www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can also visit our website at www.ypnnews.com. You can also email them at info@yahweh.com. And for all calls outside the United States, please call the number on your screen. And of course, don't forget the best study resource to the Holy Scriptures on the market, the Yisrael Says program. You can find that at www.yisraelsays.com.
Well, don't go anywhere. Up next is another enlightening message from Yisrael Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
And I'm Katan Alexander.
Thanks for watching.